I think there's a lot of different reasons that companies will engage with open models, and I think my background is studying open source software, and of course we all live in AI, so everything's about AI now, and the way we think about business models around open source software is a little bit different than how we think about open source AI, but often we think about different reasons why companies would do it, and they've generally boiled down to one is attracting more customers. So if our models are open and free to use, and then more people can use them and engage with them, then that's going to attract more people, and maybe we have something extra bells and whistles that we can charge them for, and we can make money that way. The more traditional way to think about open source is on the cost side. And so, if you're a company that has developed a model or a software package or something, and you don't want to be responsible for doing 100% of the maintaining of it, but you want it to continue to live, you can make it open source and then hope that the community out there will maintain it and help you keep it running and everything like that. That doesn't always happen. Sometimes people open stuff and nobody shows up, but it is a way to think about keeping, if that's not a super core piece to your business model, but you want the software to continue to grow, you can open it up and potentially have external people contribute to it to lower your own internal costs. So I think usually we think about that. And I think certainly with startups versus larger established firms, there's the reasons that they'll open source things will definitely differ. And I also do think one of the more recent pieces of research that we've been doing is that it turns out that developers like working on open source and contributing to open source. And so many companies will engage with open source as a way to attract better talent and attract better developers as well, because it's kind of like seen as a perk or a way that they can stay involved in the cutting edge, even if they're doing things that don't only benefit the company. Traditionally, open source was thought of as a cost saver, right? So when we think about performance, we think about the inputs versus the outputs, right? And traditionally it was thought about as it's free, it's cheap, it's going to save us costs on the back end, and that's how it's going to enhance performance. But what my research and others have shown is that especially as we move more towards cutting edge technologies like AI and data analytics, where the frontier of the technology is open source, we're seeing bigger impacts on the output side as well, right? And so I think this, yes, there's still some cost savings per traditional open source, but as we move more towards cutting edge, we'll see those companies that are engaging in open benefiting more than some of those that are engaging in closed. Now, I'll caveat that by saying I think it's a lot of the research that myself and my team have done show that not all companies will benefit in the same way. So those that already have some level of technical capability, or depending on exactly what they're building, may benefit more from using open, and others may, that have less technical capability, or the technology is not kind of critical to what they're producing, may benefit more from proprietary, right? So I'm very much in the same vein as Mike, that it's not one or the other, it's more about right tool for the right time. But certainly for those that have the ability to take advantage of the open source and tweak it and customize it in more ways than you can with closed source, then they're going to be able to take advantage of that.
Yeah, well, I think it's somewhat of a false dichotomy. Obviously open models are out there, and I think a lot of the fear about that 2 years ago has kind of passed with experience, both because terrible things haven't happened, but more so people have experience using those models now, and they're kind of a key part of global learning about how to do AI safely and responsibly. I think we haven't talked about the kind of research motivation for open models yet. I think all of the answers have been kind of couched in what are kind of the commercial incentives. But I think both in corporate labs, which kind of cross over, but also increasingly in academia and even kind of smaller open source communities, there's a big motivation to release open models, in part to enable this kind of let's figure out how as a society we deal with AI. And I think the really in my initial answer, I kind of said that a lot of the policy considerations are similar for AI, whether the model weights are available or not. And I think the key thing to remember is really marginal risk, and you need to think about that for AI overall. What what marginal risk does having AI be available, versus a baseline world with no AI at all. That has to be, that's like the overwhelming question. And then what is the marginal risk for having model weights available or not? And you also have to think about the marginal benefit as well. There's a ton of, again, like research into how we can use like uplift our cybersecurity capabilities, and by using AI and having researchers have access to the open model weights can only help with that.
I think the main driver will be accelerate the R&D, and so also, like I said, build trust, because again, as a Chinese little known R&D lab, right, by making everything transparent and people can validate it, that builds trust, and also foster a developer community. It's a major incentive. And the challenges will be really like, misuse could be one, and then also, funding the compute costs, although we're pretty smart about doing algorithm innovation, but still need to fund the compute cost. And lastly, is also competing with the closed source system that typically has a more polished user experience, right? And then, so those are the drivers and challenges.
Great.
One of the things in our work that we really want to highlight is when we say innovation, it's a broad term when it comes to what type of innovation we're referring to. We can still have innovation with closed models, right? That's AI-assisted innovation. That's not necessarily innovation on AI technology itself. So I think both are true when it comes to risk and innovation for a model on the entire spectrum, going from completely closed to many things open. And I think from a policy perspective, I think there's three things that are important. The first one is, regardless of it's open or closed, the speed of reaction, because this is a really fast-moving field. So promptness of addressing challenges associated with AI use, open or closed, is important. And at the same time, right, the openness of the model means once this material is out there, it's really difficult to call back. So it's more important that you really think ahead of time about what should be our responses. Models are different based on what type of accessibility and what users can change. So there's a lot of advantage in trying to make sure that guidelines and regulations are tailored to these type of model changes in a way that you minimize the risk, but still kind of maximize the flexibility for innovation to give you that really good kind of trade-off so that you can get to a place where you can fully take advantage of the technology and potential benefits through innovation, but minimize the risk associated.
So when you talk about regulating it somewhat differently between those two models, can you give us a little more specific sense about how you would do that between the open versus closed models?
Well, I think this is where a lot of research needs to happen, right? Understanding the ground game of how developers are providing these model-related services to users and how users are engaging with them. So ideally, these would be done through looking at empirical data, really going deep into the industry to hear how they're implementing it. Because then the danger is, once you design tailored policy, you really want to make sure it's effective in the sense that it is targeting what you want to target. You don't want too much unintended consequences where you leave out risk unaddressed or you over-regulate and that can hinder innovation. So that's where I think there's a huge role for policymakers to make a difference here, to think about how we can foster the environment.
Okay, so this is what we hear all the time, because the speed of innovation in the GenAI space, I've been in tech for 30 years, right? Shows my age. This is the fastest, right? So one of the challenges for a lot of people tracking it is that almost a model come every day, if not every hour. So that's really make sort of the people tracking it more difficult. So I think it's key to have certain set of evaluation tools where you can really filter out the goods and bads. So like that's kind of just my 2 cents.
Great. Frank, do you want to build on that a bit?
Yeah, so I think when we're thinking about open versus closed in general and the role it plays in innovation, right? We live in the US, we have a patent system, and the whole point of that is to allow people to be sort of open, but also have a monopoly on whatever it is that they've invented, right? And certainly in some industries, we'll just point to pharmaceuticals as an example, that's a huge incentive to innovate, because once you develop a new drug, then you have a monopoly over that for however long, 20 years or so. But I think when we think about AI, and to Karl's point, the speed with which it moves and the way that it progresses, like who's going to care about a patent on software that's 20 years old? Nobody, right? Like so, I think that's one of the big differences when we think about different types of industries and different types of innovation is what is the driving incentive behind behind what's being innovated. And to Jessie's point earlier, when we think about there's a difference about innovating and encouraging innovation on the algorithms, the technology itself, but also innovation built on top of that, right? And again, thinking about drugs, it's not like we're building things on top of other drugs. Yes, sometimes that happens and new drugs evolve and things like that. But in the software space and in the AI space in particular, I think of everything that any business can do with a nice AI tool, and that's going to encourage so much more innovation when it's open, because people can use it and again customize it and tweak it for the follow-on innovations versus and finding the right balance for that with the kind of closed innovation that has to happen to push the models forward, right? And so finding that right balance is something that's going to be, that's what we're here to do.
I want to just add a little bit and say that I don't think openness per se is the problem. I think it's the risk, uncertainty, and unintended consequences that come with it. And that goes back to the role of policymakers, which is there is a state of the world where careful policy design can really help us get to that sweet spot where we have a good balance between the two. And one of the things that we did in our research is it's interesting that the segment that's hardest to regulate, which we can imagine is highly capable users with very open technology that allows them to tweak a lot of stuff, is the space with the most potential, because that's where really big innovation, huge things can happen. But it's also the hardest to regulate, because you need to think very carefully about how to navigate that policy landscape.
I think you touched on something really interesting there, and that's the potential harm for having the open model. And one of the harms that people list in at least the mainstream media is the fact that these open AI tools can get in the hands of potential bad actors and do bad things with them. So where do we strike the balance there? Like, how do we ensure that these models remain open, but we ensure that they don't allow for adversarial people to, say, use them to produce a bomb?
Well, I would say, again, it's really important to focus on marginal risk and also look at all the factors that can lead to a capability getting in the hands of a bad actor. And in some ways, the closed AI is a bigger risk simply because of the massive distribution. And so there's a whole range of actors, from the scariest state-sponsored actors who have access to their own capabilities. So like open models don't add anything marginal to that. Then there's the script kiddies who just want the easiest possible thing. And it might be that a closed thing with a nice user interface that's actually cheap is the biggest risk there. Maybe there's something in the middle where somebody moderately capable can do more stuff with an open model, where there might actually be marginal risk from open. So I think it's important to think really carefully about this. This is probably not exciting for anybody who is excited about AI policy, but I actually think the most important thing policymakers can do in policy to prepare for AI, including its benefits and risks, is just like improve governance generally. Dealing with the risks, there's a broad thing called basically societal resilience. Think through, you need to be prepared for pandemics, whether or not they're engineered. You need to prepare for the power system needs to be resilient, whether or not it's attacked by AI-assisted cyber attacks. So getting the boring stuff right to create kind of inclusive, good governance, run the trains on time, that is actually across all of society is what's going to produce kind of good outcomes from the broad diffusion of AI capabilities, whether they're open or closed. That's a kind of a very boring and hard message maybe to hear for somebody who really wants to be excited about AI policy, but really get policy right in general, and no matter what direction AI goes in, it'll be good.
I think back to my time in cybersecurity, and in the early days of cybersecurity, it was all about protect the perimeter and keep the bad guys out, right? But eventually, everybody realized, well, the bad guys are going to get in, and sometimes the bad guys are already inside, and so it shifted to much more focus on, assume you're breached and control the inside and segment the inside and do all these things internally, and I think that's kind of similar to what Mike is saying, is that whether it's open or closed, we need guardrails and we need policy and we need things that will address all the use cases, right? And so I think that's a piece of that. And again, putting my cybersecurity hat on, thinking about many of the closed rails, that often the discussion is about, with closed we can have guardrails built into the system, but if it's open, people can take the guardrails off and there's no guardrails. But many researchers have shown that we can get around the guardrails for the closed systems quite easily, right? So if whatever closed system is not supposed to let you build a bomb or do whatever, you can find a way around that, right? And so I think that the risks that we see for both open and closed, many of them are overlapping, and I think many more are overlapping than what people generally think about.
This is obviously the most powerful technology that came around, but it's not the first time we deal with dual-use technologies, right? Many powerful technologies, nuclear, biotech, has that dual-use characteristic where we are worried about what if it falls in the hand of bad actors. So this is not a brand new challenge for us. So there are many lessons learned from these other technologies that we can take, and specifically also to understanding how bad actors can potentially use them and how to have tailored kind of strategies to prevent them to use these technologies. Would that be something that we can learn from previously, how we engage with powerful technologies?
Absolutely, yes. So if you look at the common belief, like Sam Altman always say, don't worry about don't think, if you're a small startup, don't think about doing anything with the model, right? I mean, DeepSeek proved he is wrong. So I think this is just an example. I think the most interesting thing right now in the Valley, there's a theory of single person unicorn. I think that's a lot of the movement where the AI first companies are the ones who can take whether open or closed source and make it really useful to their business. So I think that's a very intriguing aspect. And Jessie and I were talking about, so that there's a little bit counterintuitive because open source is hard to use by the non-technical startups. But I think the history of Linux and with companies like Red Hat, right? All these distributed companies help, less technical savvy, small, medium business customers to adopt the technology. I think that's really the sort of the new phenomena.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I'll pick up on that too. I think one important thing to keep in mind, and this goes back to the earlier discussion on innovation and use cases, some of the work that myself and my team have done on open source across the globe has shown that it's not only about the companies themselves, but it's also about the country level investments in infrastructure, education, and technical skills and things like that. And so with open source in general, we find that startups that are in countries that are less well endowed with investments in those types of complementary goods actually get much less out of using and contributing to open source. And so I think there's it's not only a story about open source, it's a story about the ecosystems in which the AI exists, and whether, in some instances, closed and user-friendly, and I can just type in whatever I want and I get back useful information. That may be the most useful thing for small businesses. But in other contexts where there's more investment in infrastructure, we can think about open being even more valuable and enabling those startups to go even further. One of the worries is that AI in general is going to lead to an even bigger inequality between the haves and the have-nots at the global scale. And personally, I think open can help with that, because it gives people the ability to tinker and learn and experiment and customize in ways that closed doesn't. But at the same time, again, if you don't have that existing kind of investments in education and in tech and all these types of things, then it may be impossible, or at least very difficult for those folks to take advantage of that.
So one of the things that we think a lot about in our work is the market segmentation, right? Which is how AI technology can be used in different ways, and how the policy environment would affect how users engage with this technology. So driving them from, like, say, if you have a country that's very strict with not allowing open source to be in place, then it will change kind of what model is available on the market. Same way, the other way around. What it means for different countries to have different approaches is that you can be hit by a surprise, right? This is a global community. You can regulate your own market, but when someone else outside of the country release something, chances are you won't be as effective. And I think it creates a danger of a model being released into a market that you don't necessarily already have the guidelines to ensure that it's safe, ensure it's safe use in a sense. So I think this is where coordinated, to some degree, kind of guidelines and regulations is really helpful in the global community. Because again, the use of these technologies are global. Then there's something to be said about having regulations and approaches to these things that are at least somewhat coordinated across different countries as well.
A big risk is actually kind of limiting that global collaboration that actually brings more risks than benefits. A lot of differences actually come at deployment. And I think in my first comment, I talked about how policy can be overly focused on models when that's just a component of an application that's delivered to an end user or deployed on a server. And of course, even an open model that's made available via a server to users in China or the US or Europe is going to comply with, the service provider is going to comply with local laws, so the experience may be quite different.
Thanks, Mike.
I'll extend some of that thinking about the policies that have been discussed and bandied about here already. And I think certainly there was some questions about should we outlaw open source AI in the US, right? Because it's going to open up, it's going to allow our competitors to leapfrog and move faster. And I think, frankly, the cat's already out of the bag. It's too late, right? And I think then, therefore, the real question is, do we want to be at the cutting edge, or do we not want to be at the cutting edge? And I think historically, open source was often a fast follower and it would, you mentioned Linux and with Windows and the battle in the early days of open source. I think often, the cutting edge happened in proprietary land, and then open source would kind of be a fast follower and an innovator as well. But today, in AI, data analytics, all these types of things, open source is the leading edge, right? And has been for a decade. And I think that therefore, outlawing open source AI in the US would be a massive competitive disadvantage, and would give, our competitors and our allies, a big step up in kind of the race to be at that cutting edge.